Sharper Than a Serpent's Tooth, written by the Hangman 317, and read by Purple Star. Chapter 20. The longer they kept her in that hospital, the more Era could feel her sanity slowly melt away. The small white room was walls closing in, and the IV in her arm was knives beneath the skin. And everything was too close and too far away and smelled so strongly of chemicals that it made her sick. Era hated hospitals. Always had. But this particular stint was all the more overwhelming for the fact that everyone always seemed to want something from her. She'd been foolish to think that there would be no more questions after that detective had left.
Do you feel lightheaded at all? Are there any gaps in your memory?
And, of course, the increasingly baffling,
How are you doing today, Suzuki?
how was she doing? Pretty fucking terrible, but she couldn't exactly say that. Apparently, they'd thought she was suffering from blood loss or some nonsense, and had been all set to give her a transfusion, until she started to stabilize with just an IV drip of fluids. Thank God. Even if they miraculously found a match to her blood type, Era didn't think she'd be able to explain away the violence with which her body would inevitably reject it. She supposed she should just be thankful that they hadn't deemed surgery to be necessary. Era had woken up in the middle of an emergency operations a couple times before. Though obviously the experience was unpleasant, she felt worse for the doctors that she definitely traumatized. It wasn't the anesthesiologist's fault that her body tore through drugs like potato chips, and the surgeons certainly didn't deserve a punch in the face for all their efforts to save a life. The fact that she'd fallen under Midnight's quirk so easily was just a testament to how run down she'd truly been, crippled by blood loss and the stress of healing injuries over and over again.
We can't get in contact with your parents. Do you know where they are?
Shit. Right. There was that, too. The well-meaning nurse smiled down at Era and carefully removed the IV needle from her arm. Finally. Any longer and she'd have ripped it out herself. Business trip to America, she said, far too quickly. Breathe. I think they're probably on the plane right now. I know, it's terrible timing. She gave a pitiful little laugh that seemed to sate the nurse, who nodded in sad understanding before leaving the room. That situation would have to be remedied, sooner rather than later. Her parents couldn't be on a flight to America forever, though it did buy her considerable time. The day passed too slowly, in bits and pieces, and then suddenly, all at once, it was night. Dark. Era hated the dark. They'd unhooked her from the heart monitor a while ago. Yet another annoyance she was thankful to be relieved of. If she wanted to, she could just lie back against the mattress and drift off into a no-doubt unpleasant sleep. Era did not want that. The dreams she'd suffered under Midnight's quirk were enough to warn her away from that idea. And even then, she'd only just begun drifting towards more dangerous thoughts when she'd awoken. She couldn't dream. Not now. With the boxes in her head all scattered about, and that memory of burning flesh buzzing across her arms and throat. The hospital room itself was small, but in the darkness, walls became gateways to a yawning abyss. And Era knew with an unfortunate intimacy how easy it was to become lost in a 5x5 room. The shadows had a way of creeping up on her, and without a wall to cling to, she was becoming more and more uncertain of, where am I? And why am I here? And the ever-important, who am I? Ridiculous. Because she was Era. That should have been enough. But still, the darkness pressed in around her, and the bed was too soft, not at all like the concrete floor she was familiar with. Yet another change in the dizzying dance that was her life. She was spiraling, and it was made all the worse because she could feel it happening in real time, and she knew why, what was causing it. Staying in this white-walled room with its clinical smells and sounds and lights blinking from the shadows, it was crawling up her throat with a slow-burning panic. She needed to leave, get out of here, remind herself that she wasn't trapped.
Aren't you, though?
Grimacing at the thought, Era slipped out of the bed.
If you're free to go, then why do you move so quietly? Are you really so naive, little bird?
Why did those thoughts always have to sound like him? Couldn't she be granted this one solace? A single reprise within the confines of her own waking mind? Era huffed, picking at the thin hospital gown as she carefully slit the door open and checked the hallway to find it empty. Of course she couldn't. It had been said before, and it would be said again. Era was broken. There would be no changing that, not without suffering. And she was too much of a coward to let them fix her like that. So broken she'd remain. She needed to remember why she was here, what the stakes were, whether she'd completed the bare minimum or miserably failed once again.
My fault.
They told her Eraserhead was alive, but heroes lie. Over and over again, they lie. She just needed to see him. Just a quick glance. Anything to confirm that he was still breathing. And then she would be satisfied. Foolish, because...
You are never satisfied, are you, little bird? Nothing's enough for you.
His voice. His voice. Finding Eraserhead wasn't all that difficult. Aizawa, his students had called him, and it didn't take long for Era to find a door with that name. Dodging nurses and doctors was even easier. Their footsteps echoed down the empty hallways long before they appeared, and they were so distracted with their work that they never noticed when she ducked into the shadows, or a spare room. She settled herself as she placed her hand on the doorknob, feeling the cold metal seep into her palm, before she finally slid open the door. This was worse. She should have known. They always told her that ignorance was a blessing, but she was always just so greedy. Always had to know because the not knowing gnawed at her bones and burned holes in her lungs. But it was better. It was always better than seeing it for herself.
Breathe.
She tried. She really tried, but she just couldn't. Not when every gasp was laced with that horrible scent of chemicals. The shrill beep of the heart monitor grated against her ears, and she could still see shattered bones, matted hair, limp bodies.
My fault.
He was alive. That was all that mattered, right? Era entered the room and closed the door behind her, forcing herself not to startle at every errant noise as she crossed over to the bed. He was alive, yes, but he'd clearly undergone surgery. Extensive surgery. Era picked up the clipboard at his bedside, reading over his treatments and injuries with gritted teeth. Shattered arms, cracked ribs, extensive internal bleeding, a fractured orbital floor, recovery of sight unsure. Sight. Eraserhead had a sight-based quirk. Era brought her fist up to her mouth, biting down on her knuckles until she could taste iron. Eraserhead relied on his eyes for his job, for his fighting, for being a pro-hero. She didn't. She could lose a limb, an organ or two, and be absolutely fine. Her head could be crushed to a fine mist, and it would be no big loss for the world as a whole. Eraserhead was a hero. He was needed, wanted, would be missed by friends and students and the world as a whole. Era was nothing. She should have tried harder. She shouldn't have been such a coward, a selfish idiot who was too afraid of revealing her quirks to keep him safe. Weakness running thick through her veins like the worst kind of poison. Her entire body was gangrenous with it, but no matter how many times she cut off pieces of herself, it just kept crawling back in full force. Now, in the after, countless scenarios harassed her like biting flies, all fat and noisome, and undaunted by her half-hearted attempts to swat them away. If she had just broken from Shigaraki's grip sooner, if she'd pressed his hand against her neck, let him dissolve her, so that Eraserhead might be forced to leave her for dead. If she had just made him understand what she was, forced him to realize that there was no point in saving someone like her. If only she was better. If only she wasn't such a fucking failure. It wasn't fair. Failure was suffering, yes, but it was supposed to be her suffering. She could bear that. She had to. Needed to. But now, her weakness was hurting others. And that was... "I'm sorry," she said. Nothing answered but the steady rhythm of the heart monitor. "I won't let it happen again." She couldn't. Era hated this feeling. The churning nausea in her stomach, and the twisted knotting of her gut. The constant pressure blooming at her temples, and the dreams that lurked just beyond awareness. There was no excuse for someone else to get hurt when she was standing right there. If she couldn't take her place, then what was the fucking point of her and her bitter, toxic, selfish quirk? Eraserhead shifted where he lay, startling Era from her looming spiral. The heart monitor quickened its pace. Oh no. Was he waking up? Era held her breath and took a step towards the bed, rearing backwards when the unconscious hero stirred once more. Oh shit. Oh fuck. What am I supposed to do? Immediately, Era started towards the door, intending to call a nurse or a doctor over, but shit, was she supposed to be here? If they caught her wandering around, would that be suspicious? There were already so many eyes on her, and she couldn't give them another reason to... Eraserhead twisted it aside, flinching back with what sounded like a groan of pain, as he balanced on the knife's edge of awareness. Clenching her jaw, Era marched over to the door and threw it open. Present Mike stared back at her with a bewildered expression, hand partially outstretched, as if he'd just been about to open the door himself. Said Era intelligently. Hey there, little listener! Her homeroom teacher regained his composure quickly, but there was still an element of surprise, and even unease, that lent a stiffness to his words. Obviously, he was trying to slip back into the radio host persona she was familiar with, but without his hero costume, he looked so different. It almost felt wrong, seeing him act out that character when he wasn't wearing the proper uniform. The mask was ill-fitting without that wild hairstyle and outrageous clothing. Not to mention the stress lines tightly etched into his face. The sound of shifting fabric behind her jolted Era from her shock. Aizawa-sensei is waking up, I think. I don't really know what to... Really? He was already rushing past her into the room, closing the door firmly behind him before making a beeline for the bed. Words spilled from his mouth in what must have been a frantic verbalization of his frazzled thoughts. He probably shouldn't be up yet, but that's never stopped him before. I should call a nurse. He might need painkillers or... Hey, Sho! It's alright. You're safe. The kids are safe. Everything is fine. Era was struck with a very strong impression that she was intruding on something not meant for her. I'm going to go back to my room, then. If you've got this, Yeah, of course. He shot her a strained smile over his shoulder before turning back to his colleague, she supposed. Very, very close colleague. Stepping out into the quiet dimness of the hallway was a jarring departure from the sudden activity in that room. She supposed, shutting the door and leaning against it with a shaky sigh, that present Mike simply instilled a certain quality of sound that permeated any space he entered. An impressive talent, though not one Era would wish upon herself. If anything, she wished she could be quieter. Still her breath and silence the patter of her heart. Set a mask tight against her face without it splintering beneath her fingers, leaving bits of porcelain embedded in her flesh. She arrived back in her own room before she knew it, feet carrying her through the halls while her mind wandered elsewhere, already weaving plans and contingencies for the trials that were no doubt soon to come. Obviously, UA wasn't as safe as she'd originally thought. That was fine. She'd handled worse. Besides, this attack would probably only result in higher standards for security, leaving the odds of a second villain intrusion slim to none. One thing at a time. First, she needed to get out of this goddamn hospital. Drumming her fingers against her thigh in an effort to stay awake, Era considered how difficult it would be to procure one of her burner phones. Given the ease with which she'd wandered the halls, not very. Era gritted her teeth as the threats began to mesh into something vaguely resembling a plan. She hated the idea of pretending to be something she'd never had, but that seemed like the only option left to her. Hopefully, she'd make a convincing enough mother to satisfy the hospital staff. End of Chapter 20.